So we start with the question, what is soil erosion? And it's quite simple. It's removal of soil materials from one place to another. And usually that's the most fertile part of the soil that is being removed. And this is by far the most serious form of land degradation and is an environmental problem on a global scale because it reduces the possibilities for the future generations to grow food. This is a problem and especially where ecosystems are fragile. They don't have the resistance or resilience towards the pressure that people put on the landscape. Some of the Central European areas are very resilient to heavy land uses. They've been used for thousands of years and they have fertile soils and so forth. But as the population increases and there is an ever-growing pressure on the land, soil erosion starts to become more and more of a severe problem, and this has happened over and over again since Roman times and later. Iceland has a little bit different story in that sense. It was only settled 1,000 years ago, or 1,200 years ago. And the settlers that came from Norway and Ireland, they had no idea what kind of ecosystems they were dealing with. And these ecosystems are extremely fragile. They have soils that blow very easily or are moved by wind and water. So they need very good protection. And the plant cover of Iceland in the beginning was mostly birch forests and willows and so forth, which were removed and were cut down for charcoal. And this is a story that is reflected all over the globe, but it happened so recently here. And it became a lot more catastrophic here than most other areas because of this nature of the soils. Climate became cooler in the Middle Ages and population was dependent really on how much cattle and sheep you could keep. And that meant overgrazing, grazing everything for hundreds and hundreds of years, with catastrophic consequences, as I said. So now we have one of the most severely degraded landscapes in the world, not only Europe, but in the world. And people started to realize this, of course, but also what happened when you remove the trees and we have something that is called advancing sand, encroaching sand in some areas. And it moved even up to kilometers in the worst years, taking down farm after farm after farm. So the people were just had to leave, to find another place to settle. And we were under Danish rule until 1918, and they helped Iceland. So it was Iceland and Denmark that established an institute to battle the encroaching sand to begin with. And that became the Icelandic Soil Conservation Institute, and it was established in 1907. And it's the oldest such institute in the world, probably. And it has been quite active since. It started with people using rocks and other things to start moving sand, and they were successful, slowly. But then fertilizer became cheaper and so forth, and so they started to work with larger areas. But they always had the problems with the farmers. I mean, they didn't want to give up the land for land reclamation. So the focus to begin with was just stopping this very severe erosion and advancement of sand. But later, with World War II especially, food security became a huge issue. So it was a reclamation of the eroded areas and destroyed ecosystems became the biggest thing, and fertilizers was cheap to start with, so to create grazing areas for sheep which is kind of strange because lamb meat is never going to be the biggest thing in providing food security for Iceland. But this is political issues. Social issues are always the underlying causes of how things develop, and that is, of course, with land use and soil erosion. This changed. We couldn't sell all this meat, the lamb. Some of it is just thrown away, or they tried to export it, so there is no market for it. So they reduced the number of sheep, and the focus shifted on restoring ecosystems as they were, sort of kind of rewilding or restoration. And now we have a decade of the United Nations of ecological restoration. And this is a big thing for Iceland, because this is where we need to be heading, and this is where we are partly heading. The government in part understands this. There has been made huge amendments to the law, but as is so common worldwide, to bring the law, execute it or do the law has been proved very difficult. I mean, when we take countries like Uganda or some African countries who took laws from Norway, and they have some excellent environmental laws for environmental wetlands protection and so forth. But the people, they don't care, and a lot of, and the same here in a way. Farmers don't understand the condition of the land. And they have a lot of saying in the parliament and in the government institutes that are responsible for the condition of the land in Iceland. So it's a tug of war. And partly this tug of war is caused by that people don't acknowledge the problem. And they don't acknowledge the problems because there are interests. This is, of course, with coal or whatever, environmental issues. The first thing that people have interest, they don't acknowledge the problem. And the farmers of society and a lot of sheep farmers, they don't acknowledge the problem. We know this, so we work a lot with doing educational materials, booklets, and research. And the Soil Conservation Service is putting a lot of emphasis working with the farmers, because that's the way to get them to understand that there is a problem. And in a way, it's working. But to give an example of the strange situation when it comes to soil erosion, land condition, and policies in Iceland, the sheep has a right of way in Iceland. If you want to grow potatoes or crops somewhere in a community, you have to fence your crop in, and not the farmer doesn't have to keep his sheep in. You have to understand that sheep grazing and sheep production in Iceland is only about 15% of agriculture in Iceland, maybe, or it's the dairy industry, the poultry, and everything else is much bigger. This is a way of living for these people. When I, told you the numbers, it's not sustainable in any way. But we also want to keep the sheep tradition, the meat for Christmas, and the wool, of course. So it's slowly changing. The sheep is slowly, very slowly, being removed from the degraded areas. But what is happening in Iceland, though, is it's become very touristic, and it's just a tourist explosion. And it's become one of the pillars of Icelandic economy. And a lot of farmers, sheep farmers, have found out they make better living just quitting the sheep and going to the tourist industry. And it's happening. We need soil and we need agriculture for food and clothes. This is by far the biggest industry in the world and the far most important. But we also consume a lot of other things, including art, beauty, books, literature, music. And we take this equally as normal today. And this is equally as important as to us if we have enough food, etc. Producing food by now, by technology and advancements in agriculture, is not very hard. This is a perspective. Agriculture is important, but all things are just as important. Agriculture is no longer the center of the universe, and it's by far. It's just one of many things. And we need to treat it as well, not give it always all this huge money, because it's very easy to grow food. We had these wonderful birch forests covering all our country. And this is what I foresee, that we will actually turn back there. The shift will end there. And there is one driver that helps changing the focus, and that is climate change. The root of climate change, of course, is CO2 in the atmosphere, and the carbon is the core of everything. Much of the CO2 in the atmosphere comes from the soil, and much of it can be put back in the soil. And it's not a stupid vision, or it's a vision that could be reached, is to make Iceland carbon neutral, basically by working with ecosystems in Iceland. So there we also have incentive, there we have money, and when we finally sort of succeed dealing with these land use issues, that's where we're heading. There is twice as much carbon in the soil than in the atmosphere and vegetation combined. Soil is the answer. It's not the vegetation you put on top. It's not the forests. It's the soil. That's where the carbon has been. That's where it's stable. And it doesn't burn in wood stoves or in industries. We have soil erosion, but we can also just lose the fertility of the soil, and it becomes degraded. And degraded soil loses its carbon. And with the carbon goes the other nutrients. It will be less fertile. This carbon can be put back into the soil. And the birch is very efficient in doing so. So in a matter of maybe 100 years or whatever, you can change the carbon content in the topsoil 30 centimeters or so, from maybe 2-3% or less in the degraded soil. In the case of Iceland, to over 12%. And that's a lot of carbon when you start looking at landscapes. Because when you start multiplying these numbers, they all of a sudden become millions of tons of CO2. Iceland releases now 4.5 million tons of CO2 in industry and transportation and everything else. But the drained wetlands in Iceland are probably, and they're used for haymaking or grazing or nothing at all, just They were paid for subsidies to make the ditches in the olden days. But these drained wetlands, they release maybe 8 million tons of CO2, more than everything else. In a way, the diesel car doesn't matter. If you have a horse that is grazing 1 hectare of drained land, your car will need maybe or release 3 tons of CO2 per year. That's a lot, and yes, it should be addressed. But the field you're using, putting your horse on, is releasing 20 tons, and we never talk about it. There are so many misunderstandings and illusions and avoidance of talking about it. People don't want to talk about these wetlands in Iceland in relation to climate change. Still, they are the biggest contributor to CO2 in the atmosphere in Iceland and degraded areas. They're still releasing CO2. And this is not only in Iceland. This would be in Czech Republic. If you degrade fertile agricultural soil from maybe 8% carbon down to 1%, all the numbers of CO2 released in the atmosphere, they are staggering. So it's all related. In the agricultural fields where you have erosion, you are removing the top layer, and the top layer is the layer where you have most of the carbon and the nutrients and also life. And there is a nutrient cycling involved because they have access to these riches of the soil, access to nitrogen mostly, and phosphorus and all these elements. And the top layer is full of life. And this life is driving life on Earth. It's the soil biota. And that's what the plants, where they get their food. So when erosion occurs, you're removing that layer, the most important, where you have all the resources of the ecosystem kept in that top layer. And this is why it's so bad when you clear cut or farm and you lose soil. Then you've lost 1,000 years of build-up of these riches in the soil. Well, all remote, there you have examples of Iceland. We have a lot of the bare rock, bare ground, bare glacial till. It's all over the place in Iceland. In Europe, in agriculture fields, it's more different. The soils become lighter and lighter, and it depends on the depth of the materials. The Romans started early, the Greek, and they lost a lot of their soils early on. And they only have now in many places maybe 20, 30 centimeters of soil above hard rock. So if you lose that, you have hard rock. And there is a lot of hard rock in the Mediterranean. On the plains of the Czech Republic and into Romania, Hungary, and further on into Ukraine, you have thick sedimentary deposits. They're loose, and it's easier for soil to formulate. So they have lost soils there again and again and again. But nature has a way to deal with this much better in these loose sediments than in where you have hard rock below. So, and this is a good thing in a way, and you can restore ecosystems, and it's easier in some places than others, and it's easy in Iceland. It's easy where you have favorable climate and these loose sediments to fall back on. But it takes time, and it takes work, and it takes understanding of what you're doing. And a final note of caution, try to fix everything quite quickly. We like engineering solutions. We like to grow things fast. And that has led people all over the globe to use introduced fast-growing species, which has now become a major problem all over the globe, also here in Iceland. the use of conifers here. The forestry people, they are sometimes the last to realize what they're doing. In Scotland, they reinvented forestry, and the forestry there is cutting down the introduced coniferous forests and reintroduce the Scottish nature. Here in Iceland, the foresters want to put in conifers all over the place. They claim not, but it's a way of thinking. And that will change Icelandic landscapes profoundly. If you have 20, 30 meters high Sitka spruces covering the land with totally different soils and ecosystems below, that's a major change, environmental change. And people need to be aware of what they're doing. And this is a big environmental debate in Iceland. We borrow the land, each generation, of course, from the future generations. But the value of the land has so many aspects. It's not the food that you grow. It's the beauty of the land. It's the carbon that you put in forests and wood products. This land, the soil also stores the history of the country, all the way from the last glaciation. It can tell us a story of what has happened. And it has been building up the riches of the soil. You know, you don't build it up in decades or few years. This is very hard to tell people when you want to bring back degraded land. You cannot do it in years. You cannot even do it in decades in Iceland. It takes hundreds of years. So wealth of the land takes a long, long time to build up. When you build up a rich ecosystem, you can do anything with it. You can grow food, or you can do this and that. That you can't do with the degraded areas. These are the areas where people enjoy also. There is a lot of value in the rich land with birch forest, because then people from Reykjavik and other areas, you know, from the towns and cities, they want to buy a parcel of that land. Its value is very high. There is also wildlife in terms of birds, and there is biodiversity values, all of these different values that come with the land that we need to consider. When you restore the land, you're not only restoring vegetation cover, you're getting back that hundreds, thousand years of worth of riches back in the soil. And you're restoring biodiversity. And you're putting back the carbon from the atmosphere into the system. And the biodiversity is not only large animals or some plants. I mean, there is so much else that comes with it. You know, biodiversity above ground is peanuts compared to the biodiversity in the soil. I think people are starting to understand this bit by bit. The solutions is always just to use ecological knowledge. There is good science, and we should always use the best available science. And in Iceland, it's quite easy if you take the sheep off. If you plant clusters of birch trees, they start to spread. They don't do it if the sheep is there. You can facilitate restoration by using your knowledge, putting in maybe fertilizer or some help with stabilizing the surface to stop erosion. So there is knowledge how to do this, and it's being used in Iceland. In big, large-scale ecological restoration projects,